Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are back again today to talk about how we form adventures. How do we build them up? How do we introduce them to players? What are some of the intricacies that we do? We had this request that was actually thrown at us in one of our comments recently. We're like, hey, why not? Let's hop on and talk about it. John, you and I were talking a little bit before we hit the record button. I guess, I'm trying to think of just for us to start off with this and how we want to talk about it. We were both kind of influenced in building adventures early on in playing these types of games. Are there some major influences of things that you've seen that kind of have tailored you in building these? Yeah, that
Um,
isn't a
I
real
think
question.
that
It's like a real question.
yeah, well, and part of it is too that I feel like that is definitely something that you were talking about influences that you had, but for myself, I actually don't know that I do because I even though I remember like the Adventure of the Week type stuff for 3.5 that WotC put out.
Hmm.
Those were things that I enjoyed running, but I never really enjoyed. I never really took them as like the basis of adventure design. I think that the adventure design that I have come up with is something that I kind of came up with organically, which is not like the easiest way of doing it. Like it's not as easy as going, hey, here's an outline and this is how you build an adventure and then learning from that. Mine was a lot of trial and error with more error than anything else. And eventually I just kind of arrived at this is how I put things together more than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know for myself, I always grab those old modules off the WotC website for 3.5, and they provided this pretty standard layout that you would see in them, and they would continue growing. But I'd always modify them in some way, and it's funny because I've hung out in Game Master's Discord. He's here on YouTube, and he's got a lot of folks that hang out in there and talk about different things they've done. And there's seems to be a majority of game masters that will take adventures, take modules, and they just adjust and change a lot of the things that are in there that make them more interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and to really speak to their player group. And I think that sometimes is one of the biggest challenges for game masters is how do I take this predefined module and rework it and incorporate it into my world?
Right, and honestly, that's something that I've struggled with as well. I don't particularly like pre-made adventures, even when it comes to the WotC campaign stuff. It's I like the ideas of some of those, but more often than not, what I will do is I will take that and take the idea and then just build it from the ground up, rather than trying to fix something. And this is something that I think that probably speaks to both of us a little bit more easily because, when it comes to writing, because we're both authors and we both write, when you have something that is not high, I don't know how else to say this, but it's not what you want it to be. It's either not high quality or it's just not the direction you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you try and get into the weeds of revamping and revising it, then you end up putting in way more work than just going from the ground up. So it's and more realistically, it's we write a chapter and the chapter is bad. You know that you need a chapter that addresses these core events or this core information, but it takes more work to try and break that down and then rewrite sentences that don't work and rewrite scenes that don't work than it is to just go, you know what, I'm just going to put that to the side and I'm going to start writing from scratch again. And that's
Yeah.
kind of the approach that I take with a lot of those is I will take those adventures and go, that's a really interesting idea. The execution is completely wrong. I'm going to start from scratch.
Yeah, I completely hear you on that. And a lot of it has to do, again, with you. I mean, we're going to dive into the things that we like to add into adventures and how we like to twist them and change them up and some of the steps that I think both of us follow pretty similarly, even if we approach them differently.
Right.
But in many of the adventures that are pre-made, I'm just God, that's really vanilla, or it's just really plain, or it's just so straightforward, or it just doesn't speak to the players that I have around the table. They're going to be like, Josh, what the hell are you doing? So I dropped an F
What
bomb. I was
what
like,
the what the fell? What the fell are you
what the
doing?
hell are you doing? And they'll be like, this is really lame. This is not something that we're enjoying, and it doesn't really speak to them around the table either. But
So,
with that being said, go
well,
ahead.
but I want to jump off on that because I think that this is kind of where I start with this. Is adventure hooks are really more easily said than done in a lot of cases. And if you try to look for hooks or you try and find the tables or the generators or anything else that do hooks, they are generic. They're almost always cliches or tropes, or they're railroady as hell. It's one of those things where it's if you really want to get your player characters like involved in this quest, then just give them something that they can't ignore, or they can't avoid. It's like, that's railroading. That's not really a hook. If you want to hook somebody, you want to get them excited about them. You want them to come to the table to engage with what it is that you're putting out there, not, I kidnapped your character's mother, and so, like, the player's like, well, I kind of feel obligated to save her, even though she was mentioned in my backstory, but I really have no, like, there's nothing else going on there, or obviously I have a mother because I exist, and you made her up in order to try and drag me along on this quest. Those aren't really fun, but some of this is also, when I create hooks, I don't always create hooks that are character specific. I will do that for you because I know that you're a character-driven player. You have created a character with a backstory, and you have given me information that I can latch onto and pull in for hooks. For other players at my table, they're not really as driven by their character motivations. Sometimes they're driven by the types of quests that they enjoy or the type of things that they like to pursue. So if I have power gamers, I'm going to use magic items to try and hook them in. If I have players that really enjoy puzzles, I'm going to try and do a heist or a mystery or something else. I'll put out the initial hooks that are not necessarily always character hooks. Sometimes they're player hooks, and player hooks are oftentimes way more effective than character hooks.
Yeah, I like that approach, and I think this is probably something that many folks nowadays, they play online, they play with strangers, they don't even have the same core group to understand who the folks are they have around the table to begin with.
Right.
And so having a variety of those up your sleeve that you can kind of offer, whether it's on a quest board or when somebody's speaking to a tavern owner or whatever, where there's a variety of different options, lets you know what your players actually enjoy doing, so you can provide more of the same as you continue playing with that same group. Because I think what you're talking about is really important when you're, sitting around the table with complete strangers and you're like, I'm trying to develop this thing for them. And if you don't know what they enjoy, you have to have that variety so that they have something to choose from and pick from and don't feel like, oh, great, now I have to just go into another dungeon crawl and just hack and slash and kill things without any other piece that's built onto that. And I personally don't enjoy that. And then you see players leaving your table.
Right. And generally speaking, and there's different ways of approaching this, right? So there is, I have this group and I know the group, so I can put out specific hooks to try and hook that group that I know. And then there's also I'm playing with a group that I don't necessarily know, and I need to figure out what they like. So in the latter case, which is kind of the case that you're talking about, I will begin with just in medias res. I will start with a quest and I will just bring them along for the journey because I need to evaluate. Like, this is my interview process for these characters to go, what is it that is interesting to you? And so oftentimes I'll design the quest with the intent of throwing out mini hooks and saying, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea, and see what sparks interest. And I will know by the time they get to the end of the quest, at least something that someone else is interested in, who will drive the rest of the group into the next arc or into the next quest. So I will do this pretty frequently. So I don't want to get too far into this because I did an entire video on sandboxing, and this is non-linear questing, and I've talked about this a lot on the channel. But this is the approach that I take in order to try and bring people in, because it creates a quest loop. I bring them in for an adventure. They complete the adventure. By the time the adventure is over, they have several other hooks that they can show interest in, which creates a new adventure, which creates more hooks, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I do want to do a little bit of a shameless plug here, that we've been working on this Dheghom project, and we have several adventures that we have been building for that project. And what you're talking about has been something in the forefront of my mind as we've been designing them and putting them together, that we want to have a variety of different options or tiers presented, or hooks that are included within those, so that people can pick those up and kind of run them with their group without, again, just being pigeonholed into one specific type of an adventure, and it doesn't offer a lot of variety. Is this something that you've been doing as well, or that you've been checking on as you've been building those up so that they kind of can hit a wide audience without being too specific?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what I go after, and so we haven't really gotten this deep into adventure or quest structure yet, but since we're talking about it, one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to this is creating the hooks that are organic to the decisions that are being made by the players. So I often will create hooks on the fly in the game based on the things that the players are saying or doing, or the characters are saying or doing, or however you want to put that together. But one of the things that I think is really interesting when it comes to not only my adventure design, but the adventures that I designed for Dheghom, is that they are the hooks that occur by the end of the adventure have to do both with what the players chose to do and what they chose not to do. And I like to take things like, what were your successes and what were your failures? What did you notice? What did you fail to notice? Because oftentimes I find things like, if you missed information instead of the common idea within adventure design and within the D&D community oftentimes is that if they fail to notice a clue, then reintroduce the clue multiple times until they get it. And this is fine if you really need them to have that clue to move the quest forward, and I will do the same thing. But sometimes there are clues that I'm perfectly happy to allow the players to miss, because if they miss that clue, it creates a consequence that I can later use as a hook in order to push the adventure along into another stage. And I don't want to ruin the quest that I've already created, but a good example of this is years ago when we were doing the Scourge of the Arcane campaign. Your group was traveling along the road, and I just put this random dungeon off the side of the road for you guys to go explore. It just seemed like a lark where you guys could go in there and just have some quick hack and slash fun, and you didn't really need to think about it very much. And there were shapeshifters inside, and you guys went inside there and you were going through and clearing the rooms, and at some point you came across this small boy. You guys got really suspicious and were like, oh, it's a shapeshifter. So you ended up killing the child, and it was a shapeshifter. So you're like, we got it. We got the thing that Jon snuck in there. And what you failed to notice was there was a second one in there who was an old man named Thaggruli that you ended up bringing with you into the nearby city of Khazar-Karath, which is, in fact, the inspiration for the entire arc for the stuff going on in Dheghom. But you brought this shapeshifter into Khazar-Karath, and you ended up infecting the city with these shapeshifters that created an entire campaign arc that you had to deal with. But all of that was because you missed the shapeshifter that was right in front of you. I was not withholding information from you. I was presenting him almost the exact same way that I presented the boy, but for whatever reason, the group kind of ignored this and moved on. But it allowed for kind of this natural occurrence, or this natural progression of events, to create a situation that you guys had to deal with. And so there was that degree of obligation. We have to deal with a shape-shifting problem because it was a problem that you yourselves created and introduced into a city. And so I allowed the failure to create more hooks instead of doubling down and making sure that you found out that Thaggruli was in fact a shapeshifter. I just allowed you to miss the information because you actually missed it. So,
well, I think it's safe to say that this says more about our group than your skills as a game master, right? Because it just shows that we are more comfortable with weird old men than we are with weird little children.
Right, of course.
But no, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have, though, about what you allow players to be reintroduced to figure out what things they don't. And, you know, you and I have had this conversation a lot, that there's certain things that, again, I don't mind players failing. Actually, you know, philosophically, I'm really big into failure being an important part of growth, and sometimes failure is necessary, and I reflect that in my games that I play with players, that it's okay for them to fail because it gives us lessons to learn and consequences and things to move forward with. But at the same time, if there are certain clues or certain things that are necessary for the progression of what I've already kind of built out and done, I try really hard not to put those behind skill checks or behind things that limit them. And there have been times in game where I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought that was a really easy find and they didn't do it, and then I have to take it and reintroduce it somewhere else in order to keep the game kind of flowing. But as somebody that's behind the screen and you're trying to direct players, I think it's important for folks to know that when you're crafting an adventure, do really well not to put key information behind a skill check or something else that is going, or a specific conversation they have to have with an NPC or whatever it is that the players may choose not to engage in, and then that information is lost, and then you're dead in your tracks with nowhere to go.
Right, and that, I mean, that honestly speaks to kind of what I was talking about before. The information that I want players to have, I will make sure that they don't miss it. The information that I'm okay with them missing, I will definitely put in those places. I'll put them behind a skill check because I'm okay with them missing it, and I'm okay with the lack of information having consequences later on. Especially if I can make sure that the players are aware of that. Like, it doesn't do any good for me to pull the curtain, in front of them, and then them never have the reveal, because that doesn't do anything. So if I'm going to do something like that, I make sure that there is a reveal. I make sure that the connections are in place at some point so that the players can go, oh, I see. We missed such and such. That is why this occurred. Because that not only, I think that it allows for that engagement and that realization and that interest a little bit, and it kind of helps players to become more focused in sessions, because then they're like, well, what am I missing if I'm not paying attention to what's going on in the adventure quest?
There's a balance that you're talking about there that is really difficult, I think, sometimes as a game master, so that players have this awareness that there's something that they missed that they weren't looking for because they were just trudging through or plodding through and not really paying attention to certain things, as opposed to the game master is betraying us or tricking us or trying to keep something from us, which really takes you away from the enjoyment of the game. And so you do have to be cautious in your approach and how you're structuring your adventure so that it doesn't come down to that. So when that big reveal happens, and be like, you were just trying to trick us the entire time. You betrayed us. You lied to us. That should not be the case. It should really be something where they look back on it and go, oh, he actually told us this again and again and again and again, and we did not understand, or we didn't take those extra steps to put the pieces together.
Yes, no, I very much appreciate that point, because depending on the backgrounds of your players, they may have antagonistic relationships with their GMs, and so there's definitely some of that where it feels like it is the GM out to get you and to trick you and to do stuff like that. And For my part, I am definitely trying to trick my players, but it's not an antagonistic tricking. It is the PC, or it's the NPC. So you go to the quest giver. The NPC quest giver may be lying to you because people lie. It is not me lying to you. It is part of the story. And I think that building the trust with the GM to recognize that separation between what is the GM saying and what is the NPC saying, where's the information coming from, is very important. And it's a difficult balance to strike. And I've definitely had sessions where, I've had a player come in there and going, John is trying to do this, or John is trying to do that, or he's tricking all of you, or he's doing this, or he's doing whatever. And it's like, no, it's never me. Like, I try very, very hard to separate myself from what is going on in the adventure, because I'm just telling the story, and I'm just giving you the information coming from the NPCs. Are the NPCs lying? Maybe, but I'm not.
John just put the NPC there to lie to us. No.
Right.
I've been that guy where I've yelled at the entire group going, John's lying to you. This person can't be trusted. It's a red herring. Just kill the guy and move on with life. And everyone's like, no, I think we can trust him. No, you can't. But it is important, I think, to have that distinction between the two and to deliver information in a very specific way. I know we've talked about a lot of theory. I do want to get down into the actual structure of an adventure and what you do. I know I'm on a soapbox right now. But
I know it's been 20 minutes of theory. We haven't talked about anything practical yet.
Well, I was just gonna say, just building off of what you said before we dive into it, is that I do approach building adventures where I want my players to be Sherlock Holmes. Every adventure to me is a mystery. It's a mystery to be solved. I'm giving you breadcrumbs along the way. Some of the breadcrumbs lead in the wrong direction. Some of them lead in the right direction. And I want you to find the different clues and put together the story at the end, which oftentimes will have a twist to it that puts you in a moral quandary. Yeah. And I almost always set up an adventure in that way.
I do too.
But I think that's probably a good stepping stone into how do we actually begin that adventure from hook to end, and what things do we do to make it engaging and entertaining for those around the table.
For me, it always comes down to motivations. And if you've been listening to the channel for very, very long at all, I harp on this all the time. We created the NPC builder that has motivations built into it. I've done posts on our Patreon about motivations. But motivations come down to why are the things happening that are happening, because it has to be driven by something, and most often it's driven by some form of motivation. So if I have an NPC, they have a motivation to do something. A brother has a motivation to save his sister. That's a pretty easy one for most people to latch onto. So when they go speak with the NPC and he says, I want to save my sister, they're going to go, oh, that's a motivation that I can relate to, and they're going to follow along with it. What they may fail to realize is that the NPC doesn't have a sister, and he's lying to them, because he has other motivations. And this is kind of the start of where I build my questing, or how I approach quest building, is that there are always overt motivations, and sometimes there are covert motivations. And depending on who the NPC is and how insightful the PCs are, they may or may not be aware of what those covert motivations are. And just because they're aware that somebody is not necessarily telling the entire truth does not mean that they know what they're lying about. So they go, oh, I get the sense that this brother is lying. They don't necessarily understand that he's lying about the fact that he has a sister.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a practical baseline for how I approach quest building, just out the gate.
Yeah, well, I was going to just add on to that a little bit, because we've seen this in your games before, and you do really well with this with skill checks. When people succeed on something like an insight check or a deception check or any of these things that are social in nature, where it's like, you know that he's lying, like you were successful, but that doesn't mean you know what he's lying about.
Insight is not a lie detector. It doesn't go, oh, you know that he's definitely lying and he's 32 and not 31. You don't know that.
Exactly, which I think you do really well with, which adds to the mystery of the adventure when we move forward, because we then have to kind of pick and choose what pieces we want to believe as a player for what our characters are going to understand without just immediately knowing what the answer is. It's not a survey says reveal, on Family Feud. So that's really exciting. But I'm similar in what you're talking about. And like I derive things off motivations, and my hooks are built off motivations. It's not just motivations of my NPCs, which I do look at, and every NPC I put in my adventure has to have a motivation behind them. The orphan on the street corner that gives you information is not doing it out of the goodness of his heart necessarily. There's something that motivates him to share certain information with you, or there's certain levels that the players have to go to in order to get information out of that individual. It's not just because I threw them in there as an information dump for some particular reason. But motivations start even from the hooks. My hooks have to be a motivation that drives the players to want to engage.
Right. So, jumping off of that, you have your hook. This is what you're dragging your players in with. And like I said, this could be character hooks, this could be player hooks. It depends on your group and your players. You're going to have the central conflict, and so the central conflict is something where this is kind of what I was talking about with my NPC. He is giving you information, almost always my central conflict, almost always the thing that is pulling the players in. I'm not giving them all the information. I'm giving them some of it. I'm giving them enough to get them interested. I'm giving them enough to try and push them forward into the next stage. I'm giving them enough to drive the curiosity, but it's not necessarily the answers to everything that they're after. So at that point, they're kind of in this position of, we have some information, we need to investigate a little bit more. So then they'll go through the process of figuring out enough information to actually be able to take action. And once they've been able to start taking action, then they start moving toward the location of the actual quest. So there's we're at 4 steps in, and they haven't even really gotten into anything. They're just in this initial process of, what am I doing next and how am I approaching this? And I think that for a lot of GMs, this can sound kind of slow and tedious. This is something that I do in conjunction with other things oftentimes at the same time. So it's like I'll layer these quests on top of each other, where it's like they might have a hook here and they might have a hook here and they might have a hook here, and then they're kind of moving back and forth, and it's not until they get to an actual quest that we start to actually move forward with that questing experience. So they might have 2 or 3 or 4 different quests moving at the same time as they're gathering information and getting more information to be able to actually take action.
Yeah, which is something similar to what I do as well. I know that I really enjoy having red herrings. I like having scapegoats. I like doing like a smoke and mirrors type of thing with my players. So sometimes I will have hooks that lead to dead ends. So you'll follow this particular thing and realize that it's not giving you the information that you need, or you're going to run into an NPC that's going to give you false information that just doesn't actually know what's going on, but they're trying to get rid of you type of thing. And then I also do things where it's like, your BBEG that you have identified from the very first hook isn't even close to being the BBEG. He's just some guy that kind of got pinpointed and targeted in some way. And players having to go around and find information on all these different levels throughout to determine what is really going on behind the scenes. I think the issue that I find oftentimes in modules that I've read and what game masters do is that they, for some reason, perceive NPCs as being stagnant. Like, George stands on the street corner and he just waits there 24/7 a day to deliver information to the NPCs, and he has nothing else going on in his life.
Right.
Instead of recognizing that all these people in the background are moving pieces that are talking to each other, sharing information, and there's time scales attached to those where certain information can be lost, certain information can be shared, and it can actually propel the bad guys on the other end to take other action because of what the NPCs may or may not be doing.
No, that's a very good point. The clock moving in the background, time does not stand still just because the players are not in the scene. You can allow the clock to continue to turn, and I think that this is also an interesting thing when it comes to what I was talking about with layering quests. So the first quest that they actually choose to tackle natively will be a lower level quest because that's the quest that they're operating on at the moment. Yeah. But what I do is I allow the other quests to kind of progress in the background. The Thieves Guild boss is gaining more allies the longer that it takes them to deal with the quest that's specific to them. The corrupt officials in the city are gaining, more wealth and more authority within the city the longer it takes for the PCs to act. So you allow those things to progress in the background, either becoming more dangerous or, even the NPC that's asking them for help or protection, maybe that NPC is dead by the time that they actually get around to helping that person because they didn't act quickly enough. Allowing those things to progress in the background gives the world a sense of feeling alive and feeling like there's movement and there's change, and it doesn't feel like that stagnation that you're talking about.
And I like making it hard decisions. And I'm going to use a quick example from a campaign that I ran in Hawkhurst, a pretty popular campaign for folks who are my player. I brought them into that world several times. I will put them into situations where they kind of have to pick and choose sometimes what quest they're going to pursue or what they're going to do. And in this particular instance, the NPCs received a letter from a high noble saying that his daughter had been kidnapped, and he heard about their renown, and he needed them to come and help find his daughter, and he was very concerned about it. At the same time, they got pushed by the church that they were affiliated with to go and pursue another task that took them out for 2 or 3 days. So what I do on my notes for my adventure is I make notes about how much time can pass before X happens or Y happens for a particular situation. They chose to go ahead and engage with the church request to go and then go talk to the other guy afterwards. As a result, his daughter had her fingers chopped off and mailed to him because it took so long for the NPCs to go and engage in that because they got hung up in a dungeon crawl from the church, where they could have probably made a different choice and saved the daughter, but then had things happen in that dungeon that would have occurred otherwise. So it's always this give and take. And I know you and I both do grimdark settings, so I like having that. So there's always a consequence. There's really not a right choice all the time on what you can do. But it makes it really fun and engaging for the NPCs. And then there's now this sense of responsibility that they carry with them because of the choice that they made.
So that's a really good point 30 minutes in, that a lot of our adventure design is grimdark in nature. Natural consequences, the accepting the failure of NPCs as accepting the failure of PCs as they're moving throughout the world, allowing the clock to tick in the background so there can't, there's no win scenarios or there's failure scenarios because they did not act soon enough. All of those are very much rooted in a grim dark or dark fantasy perspective where you allow the players to fail. And if you are running a heroic fantasy or something like that, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of what we're talking about involved there.
You might eliminate some of these elements from your adventure design. Yeah.
Jeez. So, no, it's a good point. Sometimes I'm just so focused on this is how I approach it, because even when I run heroic fantasy, it's anti-heroic fantasy. You know what I mean? Like it always just has a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a pull towards that darker aspect of the world that I think that sometimes is not intuitive for people who have only ever really engaged with WotC style material, like the high fantasy style D&D or some of the other settings like that, because they lend themselves towards success and heroism versus realism, and realism is kind of where I lean for these things.
Let's be honest, WotC's not going to hire either one of us to write adventures for them. Like we're in a 30-minute video. We're like, we killed a child and we chopped off a person's fingers and there was kidnapped. No, we can't do that in the mainstream.
No. So anyway, we'll try and wrap up here maybe in the next 5 minutes. We'll see what happens. So I think we're kind of. You and I approach this in very much the same way, which I find interesting, because sometimes when we talk about this, we're like, oh, you do this differently than I do, and I do this differently than you do. And then there's other times where it's the conversation like this, where it's like we're both on the same page almost 100% for our approach on adventure design. The last few things, and I think you've already hinted on a couple of these things, but one of the things is that I always make sure that the climactic location, whether this is the dungeon crawl location or whatever it happens to be, I always try to make sure that that's reflective of the actual people who inhabit it. And we've talked about this before when we talked about like dungeon design, but this is just something that when I am designing an adventure, if you're going to kill goblins in a goblin warren, I want that goblin warren to feel extra goblin-y. I don't want it to be something to where there's these complex arcane magical traps throughout it. I need to make sure that these are crude goblin traps or really clever ruses or something like that. You know what I mean? And I'm just throwing that out there because this is kind of the broader scope of how do I approach adventure design, and some of it is staying grounded within the particular group that I'm trying to display, or the particular adventure that I'm trying to display. I want to make sure that I don't have high fantasy arcane elements in a low magic setting, and vice versa. There needs to be that balance there for whatever it is that I'm doing when it comes to adventure design. But one of the things that you talked about specifically is when you get to the climax, there is always a final twist. And I think that this is something that both you and I embrace when we get to this point where you're right outside the final boss room, or you've gotten into the final boss room. There's always one more lever to pull. There's always one more reveal to be had. Always one more curtain to pull back, because of course there is. That's the excitement. It's like the players think they have it all figured out, but when they get into the room, you go, wait, there's one more thing that I have to tell you.
Yeah. I like to think of it as being like the Wizard of Oz effect.
Yeah.
And if anybody's ever watched the Wizard of Oz, it's all these pieces and all these things that all add up until the very end, and she finally gets back to want to go back home to Kansas again, and you pull back the curtain and it's a man running it the entire time. Like, it's like, oh my gosh, it's a whole different twist. And then you have that choice about how you're going to respond to it. Do you kill the man behind the curtain that just made you do this deed? Do you side with him and have him help you get back home again? If you don't side with him, do you never get home again? Like it's suddenly a moral quandary about how you're going to respond in those final moments because of that final lever that was being pulled, which I love the way that you word that. And I think that's kind of what I think of in my mind, because we grew up watching it. We're from Kansas, so it was a central piece to our childhood. But that's what I think of. It's like, how do I really make this reveal that much heavier on the individuals to decide what they're going to do next and what they're going to lose by either decision that's being made.
Yeah. So, and this is just for a recap here, this is kind of the broader piece for how we approach this, right? You have the initial hook or the initial NPC or whatever it is, but there's always an incomplete story at that stage. As the players move through, there are clues to be found, there's information to be found. There's permission on behalf of the GM for them to either find this information or fail to find this information, which allows them to construct a more complete picture as they move through the adventure overall. Eventually, they're going to get to the end of the adventure, and they will either have a complete picture or they will have an incomplete picture. But regardless, there should be at least one piece of information that is revealed toward the end of the adventure that allows them to have a new perspective on what is going on in that particular instant, which may affect how they choose to try and resolve the adventure. And then we get to the end of the adventure, which for me is, this is the fallout of the decisions that you made throughout the course of the adventure. So you chose to forgive the BBEG, and you realize that he's actually a sympathetic villain, and you're going to help him to overcome whatever nonsense. Maybe the villain isn't actually a villain. Maybe the villain is maybe the NPC who hired you is a villain, or a bigger villain than the person that they wanted you to kill. So then you have options of, do I kill the villain and do I kill the NPC who gave me the quest? Do I accept the fact that the NPC was a villain and I'm just going to do what it is that they wanted and get paid on the other end? Blah, 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 blah. But you basically end up in this situation to where the players are forced to make a decision at the end of this adventure, and at that point, you've opened up new avenues. So maybe they continue working for the NPC who's actually a villain. Maybe they choose to go back and kill the NPC that gave them the quest because they think it's a villain, and they piss off the rest of the organization that is affiliated with that particular NPC. Again, blah, 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 blah. But it creates a situation to where you have additional hooks that grow organically out of player decisions based on the overall quest.
I know we've been talking for a while,
yes,
and this might lead us into another 30-minute conversation, or maybe we'll need to make another video. But we've primarily been focusing on the theory of adventures and the tangible things that you can do in the story of that adventure. There's also the mechanical aspect of balancing resources, balancing CR classes, and making sure that it's appropriate for the level of your characters, and all these other pieces that kind of go into it as well. They kind of either add to the heroic feel of it because of the excess resources you have available, or give that dark fantasy grimdark feel because of what you're limiting and how hard you have the monsters that they're having to battle. So there's that element too, and kind of this pull and give of what you're going to have in regards to encounters in the adventure and how challenging those are going to be. And those encounters can really just even be survival and trying to sleep through a night and have enough resources to last the next day. So I know that's also something that you and I both measure quite a bit and talk about, and it's something that I have notes on throughout my adventure, because it's something that I'm always challenged with, whether or not I have to have waves of monsters to kind of assess what that balance is in game as they're kind of dungeon crawling or experiencing combat, or having to try to find resources. Did I not give you enough healing potions to get you through this dungeon, and now I have to, sprinkle in some here or there, or that type of thing? But it's another element to this that we haven't really dived into.
Yeah. There definitely is, when it comes to the mechanical aspect. I know that it's something that we've talked about quite a bit in other videos, and in particular when it comes to D&D 5th edition. And I know that depending on the particular gaming rules you go into, or the edition that you ascribe to, the approach is a little bit different. So I do think that that's probably a broader conversation, particularly with the new 2024-2025 rules for 5th edition, like exactly how some of that balance and stuff comes together. But I think that some of the things that you mentioned are also good general rules, which is, you have secrets in your back pocket, and this is part of being a GM, is going, do I have a couple of healing potions that I'm willing to throw out whenever I feel like the party needs it? Do I have designated areas for short rests? Do I have a timeline that allows them to get in a long rest if necessary? Or what are the consequences of taking a short or a long rest in the middle of this adventure? Just kind of understanding in general what some of those pieces come along with when it comes to resource balancing. But also, like you talked about, the difficulty. So am I going to have waves of enemies? Do I try and balance some of this up front to make the final battle difficult because of lack of resources? Or do I allow them to kind of just plow through the initial stuff and make that final battle a really, really difficult one by allowing things to pile on top of it? And some of that stuff, the way that I set it up is, if these monsters escape, then they'll be part of the final encounter with a boss. or sometimes it's like they're not affiliated at all. So if the players approach it correctly, they can avoid encounters entirely and never have to fight those monsters. And that is kind of the approach that I take, is where do those monsters end up at the end of the adventure if they're not dead? And that is also a balancing factor that I find interesting. And also something that comes across, I think, to the players by the end of the game of, oh, we allowed these guys to flee, and now we have to fight them anyway because they didn't actually leave. They went and reported to their boss, and now they're prepared for us, which is interesting as well.
Yeah. So my final note on this is really kind of what we were talking about early on, is that when it comes to all those elements too, is take notes for contingencies in your adventure notes, so that you kind of have a plan on how you're going to respond, depending on what the players may choose. And I usually like, players may choose A, this is what I do. If they choose B, this is what I do. If they choose C, this is what I do. If they choose D, I cancel this session and say, we'll come back next week, so that we have an idea of how you're going to respond to all those different things, and you're not just caught off guard.
Yeah. All right. So it's been 40 minutes. I think that we probably should wrap up. I'm not sure if anybody's going to make it this far into it as we kind of talk about theory and philosophy when it comes to adventure making, but it's been interesting. I think that it was nice to be able to go back to having one of these longer chats like we used to do for some of our videos. So.
Yeah, I agree. I hope that you guys have enjoyed the conversation. I hope that you did make it this far. And as always, we got to have that shameless plug to go check out our Patreon and go check out our backer kit for our project of Dheghom, for that campaign study manual they're going to be releasing here in just a little over 30 days. So go check all those things out and hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll talk to you again next time.